Hello. This is about Pyrrha and RWBY again. It's going to be a lot shorter and it's going to be less ranty. I'm going to update what my whole thoughts are on this situation and where I think this whole thing is probably going to go. There's one of two ways it can really go from here. Yeah. And honestly, there's not much more to say past this because really there's not going to be any new information out for a while. So there's been the past few weeks I was sort of through a war on the Rooster Teeth forums, a huge pissing war. There's people. To be honest, I'm kind of shocked. There's quite a few people that are very emotionally unstable and just harmed by this what happened at the end of RWBY Volume 3. Oh, by the way, spoilers. Spoilers for RWBY and Game of Thrones. Yeah, there's people who are just traumatized. I'm, like, shocked. I was talking to a guy the other day who was so upset he was afraid to even talk to people on the forums. Yeah, point is, it's, I mean, I don't know. I don't think Rooster Teeth predicted it would be that devastating. Of course, probably this isn't this is a minority, but you know, still, it's a little tragic, I guess. There's another group of people who, on the forums, are just want nothing more than to just see that Pyrrha remains dead, and I don't know why they hate her so much, but they just hate the fact that she might somehow be alive. At least that's the sense that I get. One of the reasons I have to talk about this again is because in the last video I had a whole optimistic interpretation about what the reasoning behind Pyrrha's death was, what they were trying to show about the character, you know, the type of story theme that was supposed to have, and I realized that my optimistic interpretation doesn't actually apply, because, as people pointed out, in the optimistic interpretation required that Pyrrha was this sort of messiah-like individual that's super introverted, driven by this inner desire to adhere to this vision of what it means to be a huntress, and because she failed in adhering to that vision, she could only redeem herself through death, through suffering. Redemption through death. It's a whole, you know, it's a classic sort of, that's a very heroic theme, but it doesn't fit her. As people pointed out, it doesn't make sense. Even though she may have felt remorse over killing Penny and creating the mayhem that was happening at Beacon, there's no way she would have thrown her life away for something like that. She was much too extroverted. She was much too, you know, she had too much to live for. She had too many things she cared about. She had too many people to love. She had a family, so on and so forth. And as someone who cares about people and knows how they care about you and how they will be affected, it doesn't make sense for her to have done something like that. The point is, I don't think she believed it was her destiny to die fighting off Cinder. That doesn't make any sense. So that whole moment in the last video where I cried, I'm just gonna say that never happened. That whole part is just, that theory is just wrong, so that doesn't count. Although it was my own, interpretation that made me cry, not what I actually saw on screen. So we're back to the cynical interpretation, and as far as this goes, the cynical interpretation is basically, there's not been a single argument that's been able to debunk it, and there's not been a single point that's been able to say this cannot be the case. In fact, very many things point to the cynical interpretation being true. I'm not going to go over every detail. There's way too many. People have gotten upset that I don't want to, like, illustrate my whole point. The problem is that we disagree on much too many things for me to just explain everything in a thread. Besides, threads are not good for communicating. I will say this: if anybody wants to talk to me about this or argue, I'm available on Google+. Come find me, and I'll talk to you about it there. If you have a microphone, even better. But just having a debate on a forum is just stupid as hell. It is the least productive debate possible. And I've had somewhat productive debates on Google+, so that's my point. But Ironically, I miss the libertarians. There's so many times libertarians get me pissed off, but man, at least they were intelligent. Yeah, the criticisms against the people who want to see Pyrrha dead they have a lot of criticisms. They really think this is her death, and there's nothing to her story else. There's nothing else to her story that's going to come after this. This is basically it. This is final, and that it all makes sense, and that it's all good, and that it adds to the story. They've never been able to explain what it adds to the story, but they say this is the position that they're defending. Frankly, logically, as I pointed out before, the death doesn't make sense, and that still applies. Nobody's been able to refute that properly. You could construct a hypothetical reason why Pyrrha would want to fight Cinder. The idea is that she was protecting the people who were escaping, or she was trying to prevent Cinder from setting off a nuclear bomb or something up on that tower. Whatever that was, it's not clear. If she was trying to protect the tower, just because Cinder was trying to take out the CCTS, she wouldn't have been able to do that because obvious. The other option is she was delaying until Crow and company got there. But again, knowing that Ozpin had failed, that too would not have been a smart thing to do. And besides the fact, she had chances to escape before when the tower was destroyed, when it was already too late. So the tower, the theory that she was protecting the tower is false. The theory that she went up there to kill herself is false. The theory that she thought she could beat Cinder, also false, because there's no way she could beat Cinder. Cinder had plot armor. Cinder still has plot armor. It's guaranteed that she's not dead in the next volume. Basically guaranteed. And, like, even in character, there's no way she thought she could fight Cinder. Cinder was a maiden. If anything, Cinder should have squashed her like a bug. That would have made a lot more sense. I mean, it took 3 people to fight one. Whatever. I don't have to, like, that's obvious. I don't have to explain that. What else? What else? The other is, like, oh, she was protecting the people running away, but they weren't in any immediate danger, and Cinder wasn't going after them, so that's also thin. The point is, that is probably the most likely scenario. But she didn't even know where other people were. Like, when she got up out of the vault, she didn't know what was happening. Everything was just deserted, and she just went after Cinder anyway. Had she known she was trying to protect people from escaping? No. I mean, it's different if you have, like, if John was being attacked by Cinder and she had to jump in to save John. It's different than that. She went out of her way to go after Cinder when Cinder was just walking about harmlessly at the top of the tower. So yeah, makes no sense. Makes no sense in any logical level. Doesn't make sense thematically either. Let's see what else. Oh, people are comparing this thing to Game of Thrones, and as I pointed out before, you cannot compare this to Game of Thrones. It's completely different than Game of Thrones. The level of writing is completely different than Game of Thrones. The level to which Game of Thrones is polished and watertight and logical, and it makes sense, is very different. And moreover, Game of Thrones is the exception to the rule, not the rule itself. And beyond that, the way deaths, there is not a single meaningless death in Game of Thrones, right? Even the deaths that seem meaningless are not actually meaningless. This, however, was a meaningless death. These are people who don't understand the difference between meaninglessness and non-meaninglessness. Pyrrha's death accomplished 2 things. It was a reference to Achilles. There's 3 things. It was a reference to Achilles. It gave us an action scene with a somewhat dramatic finale. And 3, it drove the plot forward. But it was mostly action scene, plot, and Achilles reference. None of those things have anything to do with Pyrrha's character. The Achilles reference is an Easter egg. It's what she's based on. It's not her character. Driving the plot forward because of Ruby Silver Eyes, not something Pyrrha intended, not her character, not a Pyrrhic victory. And the action scene could have been anyone. The problem with this whole thing is that you can literally take any other character in this story. You could take Yang, change her hair color to red, paint her hair red, change her name to Pyrrha, put her in a Spartan outfit, and put her in that scene, and it would have turned out the exact same way. And you can say that she was the reference to Achilles, and that scene would have accomplished the exact same thing, right? What happened there had nothing to do with Pyrrha's character. And again, the whole she was trying to protect everyone thing is assuming that that is just bullshit and doesn't apply, which it doesn't, because it's not logical. So yeah. Like, you can put any character in that role, it would have turned out the same. Nothing about that, nothing that happened there was about Pyrrha. Right? And that's the problem. And that's the difference between this and Game of Thrones. In Game of Thrones, every death has meaning to that character, for that character. George R. R. Martin's very, very careful. If you ever seen him talk about his characters and his writing and what he was trying to do, and if you just pay attention to how it's written in those books, you can tell that the intention is very clear, that there is a point that's being made here, right? That these are tragedies or cautionary tales. At least they are cautionary tales. And beyond that, they actually say something about these people. They point out their flaws, their weaknesses, as well as their strengths. Every single death of every beloved character pointed out simultaneously both their strengths and their weaknesses. It emphasized them. They lost because, and again, there's a myriad of differences, and the only real death, beyond that, there's another difference, which is that the only real death in Game of Thrones that has thus far felt as if things weren't over, that felt that there was more to do with that character, was Jon Snow's death in Book 5, which is why Jon Snow's going to come back to life. And we know that he can come back to life, and it's very likely that he's going to come back in Winds of Winter. His story is unfinished. He's going to come back. There's always going to be a character that has plot armor like that. You can't avoid it unless you kill off the entire cast over and over again, which is a stupid idea to do. If they really wanted to show that nobody in RWBY is safe, they should have killed off RWBY. On and on and on. Again, I'm not gonna go into every detail. The point is, everything about this scene felt like the writers did not care about Pyrrha. And I don't mean that they didn't care about Pyrrha the soldier who can give us a good fight sequence, or they didn't care about Pyrrha the plot device, or they didn't care about the fact that Pyrrha was based on Achilles. No. They cared about all of those things. What they did not care about was Pyrrha the character, Pyrrha the individual, Pyrrha the person, who she was on the inside. Or did you all forget about that part? Because that's a pretty important detail, that is the part, that is the core of this individual. And it's not something so superficial as, a reference to Achilles. No, that's not what Pyrrha was for in this story. And some people literally thought that Pyrrha's point in the story was to be a reference to Achilles. That is very shallow. I don't know how you get around to enjoying any character death ever. Those are low standards, pretty much. To you, this character was nothing but a reference to Achilles. Whereas to anyone who actually enjoyed the character, it was way more than that. And that's not how character design works, right? That is very shallow. There is a deep, reason to have a character like this in the story. A very deep, meaningful reason, And the problem that I had with the scene was that on the surface, was that the scene did not do Pyrrha justice to who she was at her core. The type of person that she was. It did not give her an end that made sense. It did not give her an end that felt appropriate, and it honestly robbed us of her when she could have been used in other ways to help ameliorate the story. On the surface, everything that happened in the Volume 3 finale looks really good. You have a dramatic fight scene. You have the ankle, her being shot in the ankle like Achilles. You have a plot device, where RWBY gets her silver eye power that people somehow misinterpret to be a Pyrrhic victory. You have all these details, but, the details are fine, but those are the secondary things. If the event itself is wrong at its core, if it's wrong thematically, because it doesn't do this character justice, on a deep level of who they are as a person, then none of the details matter. It's the same as Mass Effect 3. It didn't matter that they had all these, they put in all this work into creating that ending and all that shit, because the ending was wrong at its core. It had the wrong intention behind it. On and on. That's the wrongness of this scene is very palpable to anyone who really, really liked, to any critical person, A, and B, any person who really, really liked Pyrrha, because they could sense that it was as if the writers did not give a shit about this character. It was as if the writers simply discarded her. They did not care about her. She was just nothing to them but a prop to get to the next part of the story. Not only that, but it made what you did with Pyrrha in volumes 1 and 2 feel manipulative. But that's a whole other issue, right? Because everything they've done here, with Pyrrha's death especially, makes everything in volume 1 and 2 feel manipulative. That's a thematic problem. That's the problem that happens when, you know, you never actually show you never actually show your audience what your story is about, and when they see it, it's a surprise, you know. But yeah, everybody felt, sorry, everybody who liked Pyrrha felt that this was a disservice to her character because they didn't treat her character with any value. It was narcissistic on their part. It was basically the writers saying, we don't give a shit about Pyrrha as a character, as who she is on the inside, and what the point of having that in the story is. We're just going to go forward with our plan to do X. Not good enough. Like, that's not good enough if you don't design a character, you know, you don't design a character like that and then just throw them away because you don't care about them. George R. R. Martin cares about all of his characters, even the ones he kills. He doesn't just do it to troll people and piss people off. You know, if you've seen him in interviews, he wrote The Red Wedding last because of how much it pained him to write that scene. Listening to Carrie and Miles talk on this shit about AfterBuzz, they did not have any trouble writing that scene, guaranteed. They were probably laughing writing that scene. They had a real good time. They did not feel anything with that scene. That would be my guess. It's a huge difference, and you can feel the difference if you were critical, if you're critical of writing, and if you like the character enough to see, if you like the character enough to see the value in the character. So, those are the critiques, and again, if you want to debate this, you know where to find me, but really it's pretty transparent at this point. Just the quality and the intentions of what happened are fairly transparent, and I mean, trying to figure out why there isn't a consensus is something that would take us a very long time. It's not a simple matter of, oh, I just missed one detail here, or no. This goes a lot deeper than that. It's also not as simple as we just liked Pyrrha too much. I mean, I could use the same argument to you and say, well, you just didn't like Pyrrha enough. Like, you just didn't care about her at all. Actually, I mean, I don't think it's that we liked Pyrrha too much. I think we liked her an appropriate amount, and the other side just didn't care about her at all, right? Whereas they should have, in the very least, had some amount of compassion for this character, you know, in order to enjoy that scene. And the writers needed to have a certain amount of compassion for the character in order to write a proper tragedy. You know, you have to have compassion for your character in order to write a tragedy about them. If you don't care about your character, it's gonna be felt. It's not gonna be the same as a tragedy. People who write tragedies cared about their characters, just like George R. R. Martin. Whereas here, it's very, very transparent that it's like they did not give a shit. So yeah, that's just the cynical interpretation, and that's essentially what I'm running with. Unless, and there is an optimistic side to this, unless the following theory is correct, and this is something that came to light to me recently. I didn't come up with it, but it's something somebody else mentioned. But pretty much the I don't even know how to go into this. There's too many things that are off and wrong with the death. For this death to be the end of Pyrrha's story, in the very least, is completely insufficient. There is a theory floating around that everything that we saw and has happened was set up on purpose to make us feel that Pyrrha died, and that she died in vain, and that her death was horrible, only for it to be revealed later on that she never actually died, for John and Pyrrha to have a reunion when that relationship was earned, so to speak, once John had grown and become his own person without Pyrrha propping him up. That is the theory, essentially. And it is very, very compelling for obvious ways. I talked to a guy I met over this who's trying to be a writer, and as soon as I told him this theory, he's like, "That's genius! That's so genius! That's so brilliant!" Here's why it's brilliant. First of all, there's all the things people pointed out that are off about the death. There's the weird line about there's just things with the death that feel inconclusive. There's the line about destiny, the fact that we didn't get a corpse. She just turned to ashes. You know, she wasn't blasted with fire or anything. She just immediately turned into ashes. The fact that her tiara is left behind. The fact that Pyrrha and John have this sort of eternal connection somehow, which started up when Pyrrha activated his aura. There's, what else do we have? We have the disintegrating and reintegrating abilities of Cinder's bow. We have the fact that Ozpin has vanished and he left his weapon behind for some reason. We have, on and on, pretty much. We have John's semblance and aura. We don't know exactly what that does. Pretty much, it feels very much like the John-Pyrrha relationship has not reached its terminus. If this were an elegantly written, just writing-wise, it doesn't make sense to end it here, right? There's clearly something else that was intended here. There's clearly something else that should be done, could be done, that they're probably going to do. Unless the cynical interpretation is correct, of course. Clearly, this is not where they wanted Arcos to end. The kiss was a teaser. It was not... they had Arcos set up from the beginning. It was a romance to begin with, right? And it doesn't work as a tragedy, as a tragic romance, as I've already pointed out. It's one of two things. It can either be a tragic romance where the end of it, Pyrrha was supposed to just die, or John was supposed to die, they were supposed to end in tragedy, or it was supposed to end with a reunion, or it was supposed to end with, a happily ever after moment. Now, if you're doing the latter, if you're doing the former, if you're trying to just make it a tragedy, they did a piss poor job, because, all the other arguments apply, and why everything about the death that was inappropriate, it just wasn't a satisfying tragedy. If this was supposed to be a tragedy, it could have been... There's just many more elegant, more interesting ways to handle it, and why end it so early on in the series as well, if it's supposed to be a tragedy, right? The tragedy is more tragic the longer you have with the character. Or at least we've had so little time with John and Pyrrha, they barely got up off the ground. To kill it immediately after it starts, that's barely a tragedy. That's just telling us that it was meaningless. Which is why I kept saying this. What they were saying with this scene is that Pyrrha was meaningless. Pyrrha didn't matter. Whereas in Volumes 1 and 2, and even earlier this season, they kept telling us how much Pyrrha did matter. So, if the idea was to turn this into a tragedy, they didn't do that because they made it seem like Pyrrha didn't matter, whereas the whole point of a tragedy is to show you that the loss does matter, right? They didn't do that. So then the idea is that this isn't going to be a tragedy. This is supposed to be the other one. The other one that's supposed to end happily ever after. Now, of course, this is speculation on my part, but here's the thing. If you're gonna make a romance that's supposed to end as a happily ever after, what options do you have? Well, obviously at the very beginning you're going to have this whole will they, won't they phase. You're going to have this epic where you don't know whether the two of them are going to hook up, but you do, but you don't quite know. And then eventually they get together. And then in romantic comedies or just romantic movies all the time, what happens after this is there's this big dramatic moment and then they fly off together into the sunset. Of course, if that's a cliche, if you're a good writer and you want to give us a happily ever after, what happens after, the relationship is confirmed? What happens after the kiss? Well, they could just go on having happy, merry adventures together, which is alright, I suppose, but it can get boring, especially if this is a very long series and these characters aren't going to die anytime soon, or they're not going to die at all. Then that will get boring. So what other option do you have? Well, the other option that you have is to make it seem like one of the characters is dead, right? And just from a character perspective, this makes perfect sense, because it makes perfect sense to develop John without Pyrrha. He needs to, he needs to get out on his own and become more independent, right? That makes perfect sense, right? So it makes perfect sense to develop him without that. It also makes perfect sense to trick the audience into thinking she's dead, because that way, when the reunion phase happens later, it's a reunion for John, but it's also more palpable to the audience because we thought she was dead. The only thing, the whole point is that what you have to do is, if you want to make this an interesting romance that's not just dull half the time, is you want to introduce this moment of devastation in the middle. This period where we think it's hopeless, completely hopeless, because she's dead and that's the end of the ship. But of course, to make that work, it has to be a trick. It has to be a trick so that by the time you get to the reunion phase, when you find out that she never actually died, not only is it meaningful because you're happy that she's back, but it's also meaningful because you realize that what happened all the way back here was a trick. It was a twist, right? And all of the pieces were there. All the pieces indicating that it was a twist were there, and they were pointing in this very direction. You just didn't see it. It's very clever writing, right? It's like when you don't it's like you don't expect this thing to happen, but when you look back as to you don't expect a certain event to take place, but when you look backwards, you were like, oh, how did I not see this coming? How did I not see all of these signs? That's the same thing with everything that George R. R. Martin does in Game of Thrones. There's a million hints along the way as to what's about to happen to every character. So it makes perfect sense in that case. Moreover, it makes perfect sense just on an extrinsic level, right? You want to give Pyrrha you want to make her death feel tragic, but you don't want to make it feel meaningful, if this was your plan. Because if you're going to make her death feel meaningful, and then your plan is to eventually bring her back, then the death is going to feel... You're going to undermine the death. You're going to make it... If you made the death feel too conclusive and too meaningful, then when you bring her back, this is going to feel like a lie. It's going to feel like manipulative, because the intention was always to bring her back. However, if this had been a lie... Sorry, if this had been a trick... cleverly disguised as a death, but all of the details, if you paid attention to them, if you saw them, you'd see that it wasn't actually a death. Well, then, rather than feeling like what they did was a cheap, rather than doing this cheap thing and lying to you by killing her, what it ends up being is a very clever twist. So my point is if this was the plan, then everything they did up to now makes perfect sense. Because if this was the intention, you cannot give Pyrrha a good death. You cannot give her a meaningful death. You cannot give her a satisfying death. Right? You cannot make the death feel too unsatisfying. You can't make it feel too meaningless, because then nobody's going to question that she's going to come back. If you make it feel too out of the blue and arbitrary and open-ended, then everyone's just going to be like, well, there's no way that she's dead. If you make it feel too epic and too dramatic and too conclusive, then everyone's going to be like, oh, she's definitely dead, and if you bring her back at that point, it's going to do that scene a disservice. So what do is you have to go sort of halfway. You have to make it seem... You have to make it feel as if it does make some amount of sense. It does make some degree of, drama to it. It does feel sort of conclusive. However, it only looks that way. It isn't actually that way if you pay attention to the details, if you pay attention to anything that's been happening. And the guy who brought up the theory quoted something Ozpin said in Volume 2 about how if you just look at the situation like a pure and honest soul or something, then you will see what the truth is. And the thing is, I can easily see, and just from talking to you, I could easily see Monty having done this. I could easily see this having been his plan. And if it is, everything they did, everything Rooster Teeth has done here not only makes sense, but is actually just brilliant and amazing and genius. Literally genius, like award-level genius, if this was their plan. Because they will have pulled off a very captivating romance that was able to satisfy the fans. And second of all, they fucked with the fans so well to make this happen, if this is in fact the intention. Right? Because so many people think that this is done, and they think that this is conclusive. Right? Only a handful of people that really cared about Pyrrha feel that there was something off about her death. Right? I mean, that's a very good rate of people that were convinced. If this was the intention, what they have to pull off next is when they bring her back to show us how exactly it was a twist, and to make it not feel contrived. Make it feel like you're not bringing her back just to bring her back, but like this had been the plan the whole time. If they do that, I'm just saying that I called it out right now. I didn't come up with it, but I am calling it out right now. Because I could easily see this being their point. And it explains everything about how Miles and Carrie have reacted. It explains why, nobody has seemed to... their favorite scenes in Volume 3 had nothing to do with Pyrrha's death. They talked about Salem's scene and Penny's scene. It makes sense how they've basically treated her scene as a joke. It makes perfect sense why they treat Pyrrha as if she didn't matter. It makes perfect sense that they treat her as if she was just a throwaway character that we needed to get rid of. It makes perfect sense just with the whole... The whole tone of this season was supposed to make us feel like everything was shit and dark and gonna get worse. It makes perfect sense with that tone. It makes perfect sense to manipulate us into thinking that if the idea had been to always... the idea was always to bring the audience into that world, into thinking that everything was hopeless, only to then turn it all upside down later on and show that it was all just a trick. It was all a trick. It was all a lie. I mean, really, this season was dark, but nothing was as conclusive and dark, and not even dark, but just depressing as Pyrrha's death. Pyrrha's death was the one real game changer this entire season. Anything else that happened to any other character this season can be corrected. Except maybe Torchwick's death. But everything else is reversible, right? Except for this one thing. It's the one thing that feels irreversible, right? If the point was to always give Arcos a satisfying conclusion, I can easily see them doing this. To do it and then fuck with their fans for however many months, and then at the end of Volume 4 or 5 or whatever, to reveal that Pyrrha never actually died, that it was just a trick. And a very clever trick at that. People have come up with sort of the theories as to how she could have survived the encounter. I don't know precisely the mechanics of how she could have survived, but just there's enough things that are off about the scene that really make me speculate that it's not conclusive, right? And just thematically, if the intention was to create a twist, then this would be a brilliant twist because everybody has bought it. It worked. Everybody bought it. Everybody saw the thing happen and they were like, oh damn, that's it. She's dead, it's gone, and everyone's crying, and then later it's going to be whoosh. Like, people's minds are going to go crazy. Their brains are going to explode when they find out when they figure out that this was a trick. The kind of trick this was. So I'm just really giddy and excited to see if this is what they actually planned. I seriously hope that Monty and Monty is the genius that I think he is, and that this was his plan. That his plan was to make it seem like Pyrrha died. And if that was his plan, then Miles and Carrie did a very good job making it seem like that. Because, oh boy, did it seem. It had the perfect level of ambiguity to it. Right? It had the perfect level of, yes, this is conclusive, but is it conclusive? It had the perfect level of that, Right? Because that's the whole point of this whole arc, right? Make everybody feel as if it's the end, as if it's hopeless, just to turn it all around. I can easily see them going in that direction. And honestly, it would make up for this whole thematic shift as well, for the most part. I still think it's very clunky the way they handled it in Volume 1 and 2, compared to Volume 3. There's just no debating that. It was unpolished and clunky, but this twist is pretty damn impressive. And I would recommend everybody keep watching the show, no matter how upsetting it is to you at this point, because there is to me, it's 50-50. Right? It's not a question of what we saw on screen as much as it is a question of what the intentions of these authors are. It's very much up in the air as to what they could be doing here, but I can easily see this being the case. And furthermore, Jen Brown's tweets, I haven't talked about them. I'm aware that they happened, but they don't really matter here. Like, she could have been lying. She might not have known was going to happen later in the series, and the language she used is very inconclusive, right? Everything here could easily be what I'm saying, is that they're all just trying to make it seem desperately like Pyrrha's dead. The only thing that's really riding me on the fact that she's not is that it makes for a much better story if she isn't. It makes for a much better story if they intended to make it seem like she was dead, only to have it be a twist. Another funny thing is, I just noticed, is that a lot of people really just came out of this episode, just based on their comments, feeling that Pyrrha wasn't dead, right? It wasn't until Jen Brown made her tweets that everybody started saying, that everybody sort of started giving up. I feel like if Jen Brown had not made those tweets, a lot of people would still be under the impression that Pyrrha was alive. Like, it would be much closer to like 50% of the community had she not made those tweets. So I don't know if those tweets were staged. I suppose they'd have to be to an extent if the theory that Pyrrha and John are supposed to have a reunion is valid. I mean, I guess it would have to be. But her tweets have had a very big effect, is my point. Right? Without those tweets, a lot of people would have thought that this was not Pyrrha's death. And because, again, there's lots of ambiguity to what happened. So if this was their intention, and I know that they like trolling, Rooster Teeth loves to troll their audience, then I can easily see them being... Because this accomplishes simultaneously a very good dramatic story with a very clever twist, whilst fucking with your audience to an insane meta degree. It would be fantastic. I relish at the thought that this is what they had planned. It's not so much a theory, though, as it is an ultimatum, because honestly, I see it going one of two ways. Either this was their plan, that this was always just a trick and a twist, and it's amazing, or Pyrrha's death is exactly what it looks like, and she's just dead, and the end of the story, GG, Arcos is sunk. And then, if that's the case, that's just bad storytelling for all the reasons, previously given. So it's a choice between really good story and pretty bad story. It's a choice between really good and really bad. 0 or 100. If they don't do this, they will have made a huge mistake. It will have been a huge blunder, and I don't really care if this was Monty's plan. If this had been his plan to make this into a tragedy, this would have been a bad plan, because everything about this is perfectly set up for Pyrrha and John's reunion. Just thematically, logically, everything. That's all I have to say. So all I'd recommend is to just stay hopeful and just keep watching RWBY and just see if this theory pans out. And if it does, remember that I called it. Damn it. All right. Cheers.